I'm James Beckwith, President and CEO of Five Star Bank. As a community bank, we believe that open dialogue about the issues affecting our region is vitally important. From the economy to the environment to social issues, we look forward to the conversations and hope you'll join in.
Hi, I'm Scott Syfax, and welcome to Studio Sacramento. Today is one of a series of conversations that we're having with our region's elected officials. Our goal is to get beyond the Washington soundbites and to give the public a greater understanding of the people that represent us. Today we have a husband, a father, and a grandfather, and California's congressman representing the 3rd Congressional District. Representative Dan Lungren joins us today on Studio Sacramento to discuss his story, past, present, and future. Welcome, Congressman Lungren.
Hey, thanks very much for having me, Scott.
Glad to have you here. Congressman, at 64, you've spent approximately half of your life in public service. What's driven that commitment?
Well, more than anything else, is the example of my parents. My dad was a practicing physician. I like to say an old-fashioned family doctor, meaning that I remember in the last week that he practiced medicine, I happened to be staying at their house, the old family house in Long Beach, and he was age 70 at the time. And this is the last week. He got up twice in the middle of the night to make house calls. That was my exposure to what commitment and service to others is. I used to make house calls with my dad when I was a kid. I used to go make rounds at the hospital. I thought I was going to be a doctor as he was, and I went to Notre Dame with the expectation of doing that. And God sent me a strong message my sophomore year, called organic chemistry, and I figured I need to do something else.
You did really well at that one?
Well, I didn't flunk it. I did pass it, but it gave me a very good idea that maybe that wasn't my forte. And so when I started practicing law, I also reflected back on the volunteerism that my dad and mom did, and it was in politics. I never got paid for it. They always were active in it. And I got very much interested in it, and that's my outlet. I mean, that's my way of serving in the manner or in the emulation of my dad. Public service gives me an opportunity to give to the community and to serve others as my dad did.
Now, your dad was, one of his claims to fame was he was President Nixon's personal physician.
Yeah, he knew Richard Nixon for about 40-some years. He was a volunteer campaign physician, meaning that from the time I was a little kid, Dad used to go away for a couple weeks every 2 years on campaigns, volunteering, not getting a single penny for it, but taking care of the candidate, members of the campaign team, and the press when they were sick. So this was before you had instant television. So Dad would call us from somewhere in the country where he was traveling on a vice presidential campaign or presidential campaign or campaign on behalf of other candidates, and he would say, well, we had a great trip to Chicago, and he would describe it to us. And then we would watch the nightly news, which would about 2 days later show it. So you saw those things, and you very much became concerned about international affairs and national affairs. And when President Nixon left the White House, as we all know, he then returned to California, and he had that phlebitis, which actually developed into a full-ranging, life-threatening situation. And he asked my dad if he would care for him again. My dad had been his physician before he was in the White House, and he did, and helped him back to health, and also helped Mrs. Nixon back to health when she suffered her stroke while living in California.
Now, your dad is referenced a great deal in writings about you. Like, tell us a little bit about Mom.
Well, my mom was from Chicago, and one side of her family was Swedish, one side Irish, as was my dad, interestingly enough. My mom remembers her Swedish grandparents spoke no English. Her dad died at a very young age. He was in his 20s, an accidental shooting. He was an old revenue agent, the kind that were going after Capone in those days. So she was fatherless from the time she was about 4, and then her stepfather had difficulty keeping a job during the Depression. So my mom ended up working from the time she was probably 12 years old. And She did many jobs, but interestingly enough, she was a model, and she was Miss Television of 1938
Really?
at the 38 or 39 at the New York World's Fair. So, and then she came out to California. She actually had signed a contract with one of the studios, and ended up working as a secretary for one of the, we call them aerospace, but airplane firms there, and met my dad on a blind date. And they were married just before my dad shipped off to Normandy as a battalion surgeon in World War II.
Now, her father's untimely passing, your father was very much involved in medicine.
Right.
Any impact on your focus in terms of law enforcement? Because every reference to you, there's a centrality to law enforcement and order and justice.
Yeah, I was exposed to people who served. My uncle was a career in the United States Air Force. He was a member of the Strategic Air Command. Was unable to go to college because of the financial situation of their family. My mom actually didn't graduate from high school until she took adult classes when I think 5 of our 7 children were already around. So I don't know where the focus on the law came from, except that I was always impressed by people who served in police departments and sheriff's departments. I just admired them from the very beginning. It wasn't just the sense of authority, but it was the sense of service. And so when I had an opportunity, when I ran for office the first time I was elected to Congress, I wanted to be involved in issues dealing with public safety. Interestingly enough, one of my law partners, I was a very young, I was associate and then had actually qualified for partnership when I ran for Congress the first time. One of the partners in the firm was Pat Brown, Jerry Brown's dad.
Really?
And Pat was in the Beverly Hills office, I was in the Long Beach office. He used to send me, I think, some of his, I used to call them dog cases, cases that a young attorney would take over. But we would talk a little bit of politics, and he'd talk a little bit about his son and so forth. When I went to Congress, when I was elected, he called me up and he said, Dan, he said, I have been working for a number of years on a national commission to reform the federal criminal code. Bipartisan commission, he'd been nominated, I believe, on that by LBJ. He said, it's fallen on deaf ears. When you get back there, would you take a look at it? That was my initial focus on reforming the federal criminal code. I specifically got on the crime subcommittee because Pat Brown had said this is an area that really needs work and no one's working on it. So I was the one who led the fight for the Comprehensive Crime Control Act reform that Ronald Reagan signed. It was more in the vision I had of it, but the genesis of it was a phone call I got from Pat Brown. In fact, I don't think I've ever told that story before.
Well, the security issues in law enforcement, again, seem to be central to your political philosophy. You were involved in the creation of 3 strikes, Megan's Law, your work on Homeland Security, and now you chair the House Administration Committee. How has sort of the accumulation of that experience, as you're doing your work, how does that inform your political philosophy?
Well, look, I don't think there's any doubt anybody who'd look at my career would say he believes that national defense is the most essential obligation of the federal government. I felt on the state level when I became Attorney General that I could play a key role in giving voice to what I consider to be the innocent victims of society, the ones who have been subjected to crime by predators. And I didn't feel their voice was being heard, that the system correctly protects anybody charged with a crime. I mean, that's part of the essence of our system. But I thought we had, if not turned a blind eye, we had ignored in great measure the plight of the victims and the victims' families. And so I guess I was informed in large part because I'm one of 7 kids. You grow up with 6 members of your family. You look out for one another, you fight with one another, but there's a sense of community within that family. I happened to go to Catholic school all my life. There was a sense of community that was conveyed there. And I express my obligation to my sense of community in trying to do what I consider the most essential thing, that is giving people a modicum of security so that they can live their lives in a way that allows them to use the talents God gave them. So that's what kind of drives me in these things. It's the most essential obligation of government is to give people some protection, I think. Not to give them such security that they don't believe that they have to be responsible for their lives, but so that, I'll put it in very simple terms, I always thought that people who commit the crimes ought to be behind the bars rather than senior citizens afraid to go out in the street behind bars in their own homes.
Okay. Well, I want to come back to that in a few minutes to talk a little bit about the balance between security and intrusion, but let's stick with family for a second. Those who know you best typically reference family when describing the core of your values. What does family mean to you?
Oh man, it means everything. I remember I was asked one time when I was a congressman the first go around, and they said, what do you want to be known for when you leave? And I said, being a good father, being a good husband. Now I'll add being a good grandfather. You know, that's what life is about as far as I'm concerned. I grew up in a loving family, 7 kids. My dad worked very hard as a doctor. I saw the commitment he had to his patients, but he had a commitment to family. When we went on vacation, they took the whole family. And I remember some friends of my dad saying, you know, why do you take all 7 kids? I mean, you pack them in a station wagon, you drive off. How can you get any rest that? And my parents' response was, well, that's who we are. We're family. So that's what my experience. And when I got married, I mean, you know, we looked forward to having a family, and we tried to include our kids in everything. When I was in Congress the first 10 years, we would travel, every other year we would travel across country. Instead of flying, we'd drive, because I wanted our children to see, well, we basically would stop at national parks or state parks. I wanted them to see this country and understand, and I wanted them to be familiar with California and with Washington, D.C., and I wanted them to see everything in between, so that we weren't just made up of 2 coasts. And to me, you do it with family. For me, I get far more enjoyment when it's shared with my family than I do doing it by myself.
Right. Well, in terms of family and the enjoyment you have, there was a recent significant event that took place, right?
Well, our youngest daughter, Kathleen, was married. So all 3 are married, and all are doing great. I've got 6 grandchildren. Jeff has given us 4. Kelly has 2 children, 2 stepchildren who we consider our grandkids as well. And then Kathleen was just married. And it was a great wedding. She wanted to have it back in Washington, D.C. Even though she was born in California and spent most of her life in California, she's enjoyed the experience in Washington, D.C., and she wanted to be sort of a sense of history in D.C. And her husband, my new son-in-law, Usman Job is his name. He's a native of the Gambia, and just a great person. And you just have to reflect on that. Both of my parents are Swedish Irish. My mom remembers her immigrant grandparents who spoke no English. My daughter now is married to someone who was born in a country in the central west coast of Africa, who actually, because his father was in the diplomatic corps, went to school in Belgium and in Paris, but then got his college education at Berkeley and his master's at Northwestern. You talk about the world becoming smaller. It couldn't be more obvious to me than when we have all the family together.
Sure.
And it's an amazing thing, particularly since he talks about when he showed up at Berkeley, and he was at the gym, and they had a basketball game. And after it was over, some of the people said, we had to pick the only black guy who can't play basketball. The fact of the matter is he's a great soccer player, but in his experience, he hadn't grown up playing basketball. It's the stereotypes that are broken down by just interacting with someone in your own family who's from a very different background is absolutely amazing. But what is even greater underlying it all is you realize the centrality of humanity. I mean, you realize that, you know, deep down we're all very much the same with very much the same values. His commitment to family is unbelievable.
Well, speaking of that universality, there's a
Yes.
universality of being a father. And there's a story that I've heard about a message that you gave as a loving father to a prospective son-in-law.
Well, when he came up to ask for her hand in marriage, which I thought was great, and we had about a 6-hour conversation. Actually, it was over dinner at our house here. He'd flown up from Southern California, hadn't told my daughter he was coming up. And so we spent about 2 of those 4.5, the 6.5 hours really talking about the prospective marriage. And in there, I wanted to convey how I feel about my daughter. And I just said, have you ever seen the movie Taken, the one with Liam Neeson? And I said, remember the scene where Liam Neeson is on the phone with the kidnapper of his daughter and says basically this, you don't know who I am, but in my former life I've developed certain skills that make me very dangerous, and if you let my daughter go now, nothing will happen to you, but if you don't, I'll hunt you down, I'll find you, and I'll kill you. Now, I said, that's not my message to you in that I would do that. It is, that's how I feel about my daughters. I would move heaven and earth for my daughters, and I just want you to know that. And I know you love my daughter, but you have to understand my love is so strong that I would do anything to make sure my daughter's not hurt. I think the message was received because he has said to me, don't worry, I will take care of your daughter, and on every anniversary we'll watch the movie. It was kind of funny. You have to understand, my daughter worked in the movie industry after she graduated from Loyola Marymount. That's a medium that they, and many in their generation that they know, really relate to. And so I thought that was a direct way to get a message across that I'm glad you love my daughter, but I love her too, and make sure you don't hurt her.
So to come back once again on that theme of family values and the like,
Yes, sir.
Your parents inspired you when you were in your youth. Who inspires you today?
Well, I would say some of the people that I have had the privilege of serving. One was Ronald Reagan. I mean, to have the opportunity to serve as a member of Congress in an effective way, to work with him personally, I mean, to carry his criminal justice legislation, the Immigration Reform Act, I was one of those who got him to sign that. Just working with him and being around him and seeing him and being inspired by him, probably that would be my #1 inspiration. There was another person in the Congress, Henry Hyde, who since passed away, great leader on human rights, and we worked together on civil rights legislation and on pro-life legislation. A very inspiring person in my life. Not perfect, and he would admit that he wasn't perfect, but someone who gave great leadership. Those are probably 2 of the people that have inspired me the most in public service.
Well, both Reagan and Hyde were members and a part of an era. And they served with people like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Tip O'Neill, and the like, where people were able to reach across the aisle and work on very tough issues despite strong-held political philosophies and come to a conclusion for the betterment of the country. The recent debt ceiling battle has left a lot of people in this country questioning whether our political system and just basic civility is irreparably broken. Is the current political environment, from your vantage point, a passing phase, or has something fundamentally changed in this country?
Well, you know, I've had the opportunity to be in Congress for 10 years, be out for 16 years, and then be back in. So I guess I have a little different perspective than some. There's always been partisanship. I mean, we do look back at Ronald Reagan, Tip O'Neill, and we say, let's go back to those great old days. Man, there was tough partisanship there. There were tough words there as well. I think one of the biggest differences is more members of Congress used to live back in Washington, D.C., used to bring their families back. And as a result, you got to know one another as families as opposed to just fighting it out on the floor. I think that was one of the things that's made it more abrasive, even though there's still, in many ways, it's very similar to the fact that you always have partisanship. The second thing I'd say is there's nothing wrong with partisanship properly understood. If you feel very strongly about your principles, there's no problem. In fact, it ought to be an opportunity for a clash of those ideas, and then out of that comes your final decision. And the third thing I would say is something that was told to me, well, I was present when he said it to a group, and I introduced him to speak to this group. It was Justice Scalia. And he said, you have to understand our founding fathers created our system to be inefficient so that no one man, no one party, no one faction, no one branch of our government could impose their own will. And he said that is the greatest single protection of our freedom in our system. Not the Bill of Rights, as important as they are, but the structure of government established by our founding fathers. So I understand there's that inefficiency and there's going to be that frustration, and it doesn't look good coming to a conclusion, but in part it was set up by our founding fathers to make sure no one could have the stronger edge such that our freedom would be endangered. And I think that balance of powers and that tension between the different branches is important.
Well, in terms of balance of power, you know, you've won a lot of races, you've lost a few, okay? One that you lost was running for governor against Gray Davis. What did that experience teach you about California, and what did you learn about yourself?
Well, I realized the California of today is not the California of Ronald Reagan. There have been major changes, and we could go into that, but that's really another story about not necessarily the demographics, but the change of the economy, the nature of the economy here in the manufacturing base and aerospace and military and so forth that has changed. What it did show me was that it's awfully difficult in a statewide race running for governor to get your arms around your campaign. You spend so much time, particularly with the raising of funds, that it's difficult for you to be able to concentrate on your issues and the way you want to communicate it and your sense of the response from the community that you're dealing with. In Congress, I have a chance to get my arms around my district, meaning that I can have enough town hall meetings. I can, for instance, I'm home here during this August period. I'm having 17 speeches, 3 town hall meetings, numerous meetings in my office. I'm going out and visiting various job sites to find out what the people who are creating jobs say is necessary and appropriate as opposed to what the quote-unquote Washington experts say. But I can do that from a geographic standpoint, from a time standpoint, from an energy standpoint. So it was disappointing and unsatisfying in the sense that I didn't believe that I was able to communicate my message to the people of California in a way that I thought they understood and therefore could make a judgment on what I wanted to do. Now look, that's my failing as a candidate. I'm not putting it off on anybody, but I was unable to successfully communicate to the people of California, and my hope is that with the social networks, with the expansion of opportunities of communication, with the proper use of the internet and a number of other things, the means of communication so that you can engage in a true dialogue with your constituency may be enhanced such that the money required to be on TV is not as dominant a factor. Now, that may be an idle hope, but I do recall this. When I ran, and that was 13 years ago for governor in the state of California, we actually got an award for the best website. We didn't know what we were doing. It was a very static website. Our capacity to get our message across via the internet was very limited then. Now I see it as a tremendous opportunity, not only on the official side, but on the political side, and so many people, individuals, organizations that before, well, look, I'm not part of the establishment or we haven't been involved in this long enough, were not able to get their message across, now can get their message across.
So does that mean you'll try it again?
My wife and I just celebrated our 42nd wedding anniversary. We would not reach a 43rd if I said I would try it again. And since family's important to me, I think you know the answer to that question.
There you go. Well, let me ask you a reverse question. If you were advising the Democrats, who do you think is a rising star in their party and could give the Republicans a real race in 2016? We'll skip this next presidential campaign.
Oh my goodness. On the Democratic side, you know, normally you would look, if you're looking for presidential races, history would tell you to look at governors. I haven't had enough opportunity to be exposed to governors from other states most recently. Look, I had been impressed in the past with Evan Bayh. I mean, I think he's now exited the scene, but he was the kind of profile I thought was one that would be very successful on the Democratic side and be able to get crossover votes. I happen to know his dad, Birch Bayh, very well, who would be considered a quote-unquote liberal Democrat. Evan was more of a moderate Democrat and was able to be elected in a Midwestern state that generally trends Republican, Indiana. That would be the kind of person. I see some exciting people on my side of the aisle. You know, I'll throw somebody out, very controversial. Alan West is one of the most intriguing people that I've ever met.
We could spend an entire show just on that individual. I have to ask you this question in our final minute, though. The recent redistricting has left you with a district that is increasingly liberal, and the political commentators have all been speculating about your plans in terms of whether or not you're going to run in this district or your current district, or you're going to run in the adjoining district that is currently held by Tom McClintock. What are your plans?
First of all, I got to find out what the final maps are, because even though the commission has spoken, there's a question about referendum or lawsuits. If we have the plans as they exist now, that means they've cut my district up 5 different ways. The largest geographic part of my district is in the district that you described as Tom McClintock's district.
Okay.
The largest population is in Sacramento, and that's where my home is.
Well, and on that note, unfortunately, we are out of time, Congressman Lungren. We have really enjoyed our time with you.
Thank you very much.
And would like to welcome you back to talk about what's going on in Washington.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I would like to thank our guest, Congressman Dan Lungren. That is Studio Sacramento for today. There's lots of talk on television, but only a few places where you can be a part of the conversations that matter. I'm Scott Syfax, and you've been watching Studio Sacramento. Join us next time right here on KVIE.
I'm James Beckwith, President and CEO of Five Star Bank. As a community bank, we believe that open dialogue about the issues affecting our region is vitally important. From the economy to the environment to social issues, we look forward to the conversations and hope you'll join in.